Welcome, my name is Olga Temanova, and I'm glad to see everyone who has joined at the Media Hut at the Media Center at Ukraine Forum. The war is raging on for the 10th year. Today, the day 544 since the aggression started. Today's topic is very important. We are talking about the reforms for our victory. Recently, the think tank Vox Ukraine, together with the Factum Group, have conducted a survey, and they have identified something that is no surprise. Ukrainians believe that the anti-corruption reform is very important, followed by the judicial reform and health sector reform. So today's panelists embrace all those stakeholders. We'll be talking about the successful reforms. We'll be talking about why some reforms have become high-profile reforms, others are not so active. We'll be talking about the participation of the civil society to bring the victory closer. Today's participants are Sergii is the CEO of the Supervisory Board of Prozorro.Sale. Mr. Banik is the Director of eServices at the Development and Directorate of the Ministry of Digital Transformation. Mr. Rabets is the Deputy Head of the National Health Services of the Ukraine for Digital Development, Digital Transformation and Digitalization. We're still waiting for Mr. Sluchik to join us. He is part of the Integrity Cities component of the Anti-Corruption Initiative of the EU. Irina Chekhovets is the head of the National Agency for Corruption Prevention Integrity Office. Svetlana Slipchenko is the project manager at Vox Czech. Before we begin the discussion, let me also introduce to you our analysts. These are Irina Chekhovets, Ilona Solohub is the scientific editor at the Vox Ukraine, and Nikolai Rezarova is joining us online. She represents the other organization. We will now be listening to the presentation of the survey. What are the results? Now, before talking about the results, I will brief you on the methodology of the survey, those who participated and who the respondents are. We've been testing the public opinion. We've conducted 1,000 interviews online, and the age range was from 18 to 60. This is not a commercial survey. We've been doing that within the framework of the sociological study. The first slide shows the response to the question, what people want to be reformed. What are the need for the change? The answer number one is fighting the corruption. Top 5 most important and key components are medical reform, judicial reform, reform of the education, and pension provision. The next slide has the list of all the exhaustive lists and numbers on the left side of the screen, but they also have been offered a list to choose from and to arrange in what they think is high priority issue. On our website, the information is available. Apart from the top 5, I should also draw your attention to the need for the army to be transformed. What do people expect from the reforms? In the first place, as it has been mentioned, the corruption and the embezzlement of the state purse. That should be the final result of all the reforms leading to the welfare of the Ukrainians. From in the range of 1/3 to up to 40%, the reforms are called for the state budget to be officially used for Ukraine to join the European Union, for the GDP to grow, and to make sure that the public have a say in the priority of the government issues. What are the obstacles? The corruption is something that people believe to be the major obstacle on the way to reforms. This seems to be a more important factor than the military conflict with Russia. There was also an open question on how people understand the reason of the corruption. You see, we have arranged them in a number of headlines: the avarice mentality, the resemblance of the Soviet-style management, but in general, it's all comes down to something that's not working. The judicial system, when people can bribe the judges, which is to say that people who are called to fight for the judicial equality are the people who are the source of the corruption in this country. The other part of the survey is this. We asked the respondents to assess the 11th reforms that have been conducted. On the screen, you see what they have been offered. We asked them whether they have heard about such a reform, and if positive, do they believe it to be important for Ukraine, and what their assessment was in terms of its implementation. I will give the floor now to Ilona, who is joining us online, but before she gets the floor, a couple of words on the importance. The importance of the reform. I think everyone expects the result that all Ukrainians believe. This country needs all the reforms. There are not minor reforms, but a super important is the reformation of the armed forces. That's number one. And the rest of the respondents believe that the digitalization reform is important, the reforms of the anti-corruption bodies, including judicial and educational reforms. Ilona, I hope you are with us. Welcome. Glad to join you. I will take from here the importance of the reforms. Veronika has suggested that our compatriots believe that all the reforms are important. As for the awareness, the situation sadly is different. This slide shows the dark blue color indicates those who said they heard. The other part, the light blue, where people respond that they have heard something, and the yellow part tells us about the people who have never heard about such reforms. We have also analyzed the specific characteristics of the public activists and how the public activity impacts the performance of reforms. A general conclusion is that when people confront some sphere in public life, they are likely to be aware of the reforms. Women, for example, know more about the healthcare reform or education reform, perhaps given that they are in charge of issues like education of their children or the state of the healthcare in their communities and homes. Decentralization perhaps touches upon those who are part of the law enforcement activities. As for the success rate, the people who responded that they were aware of some reforms, they were asked whether they believe the reforms to be efficient or inefficient. The most successful are believed to be the system of state procurements and the reform of the armed forces. Decentralization and public procurement seems to be at the top of the success. The least successful are judicial reforms, and we know why. And it is because this reform has been going through tough time. The respondents have heard or know something about such reforms is based on their awareness from the mass media. I would like to draw your attention to the fact that people believe the medical and healthcare reform to be inefficient. And this explained, perhaps, by what they have heard in the media. Their expectation, perhaps, was that public healthcare system would be free of charge and they will be having all the services at the first request, something that is not available in many countries. We have also looked into the type of the respondents, whether they believe that the reforms are efficient or otherwise. The result is that the respondents who are more aware tend to believe that the reforms have been successful. Younger people and those who have participated in the law development, and perhaps the latter point is explained away by people's awareness how complicated the law development is. In a way, the functions of the country that has been taken by the civil society, those people tend to believe that reforms are not that efficient. Our hypothesis is that people take on themselves what the state is called to do. The community, the feeling of community. Of course, we understand that back in March, at the beginning of the full-scale aggression, people were united. And then this feeling of being united goes down. It's still higher than during the pre-war period. People are aware that we should help each other, we should work for the country. And this is not the time to get involved in your own business. The next slide shows the most popular activities. These include volunteer work, donations, and active participation. We see that the donation share has grown, but it tends to go down a little bit. Perhaps the civil engagement is explained away by the fact that people sometimes don't have enough time or resources. The next slide, the light blue stripes, shows that the number of people who have joined the volunteer activities has dramatically increased. It's important for this impulse not to go down. The number of people who have joined is much higher than the red part of the slide. Public awareness of the people on how they can participate in some civil activism. The three higher points are donation, signing the petitions, and volunteer activities. That is to say that civil organizations, non-governmental organizations, would be more active if they had more information on the importance of such engagement.
Тут також ми дивилися, як
We have also analyzed the efficiency rate of some activities and the plans of the people to be engaged during the next 6 months. People who have been already engaged, which is 90% of those, are planning to keep on working in that area. This is quite a high number of social activity that is still being retained. It is understandable that if people believe that their impact is important, they're planning to stay on board. That is to say, Ukrainians believe the reforms to be very important, but the public awareness must be raised because our survey has shown that sometimes people don't know about particular reforms, which is to say that they don't understand the essence of the reform. In the first place, Ukrainians expect the rate of corruption to go down, and they want to support their armed forces and are betting on the success of the anti-corruption reform. The participation in the NGO activities has grown, but there is a tendency towards this activity to go down. The engagement will grow in terms of those respondents who already know how to do that and who believe the efficient nature of such activities. This is where I would like to wrap up. Thank you. Everyone understands now that reforms are important. We know the reason why they should be performed. I would like to ask Mr. Sergii, but Ukrainians believe that anti-corruption is priority one. The project that you run is very important. Have you been successful? Reforms to be successful is at the rate of 20% in the public opinion. What do you think? What has been effective? What has not worked? Indeed, what I have been pleased to hear as the Supervisory Board CEO of the Prozorro.Sale, it's important that people believe that the toolkit that our project is developing, that people believe in it, the small-scale privatization and the land reform. In this system.sale, back in 2018, we initiated first electronic bidding in the smaller scale privatization. It is now for 2 years when the reform of the land is running and the bidding on the lease of different types of property. This is done through the transparent electronic bidding process. Correspondingly, in these spheres, in the smaller scale privatization and in the land bidding processes, there is an impulse of reformation has been built into that. Never before in this country have we seen such an easy and transparent access to specific and deficit property that has been owned by the state, apart from the merely forms of the reform such as smaller scale or land reform per se. It has to do with the anti-corruption. It has to do with the digitalization. It should be also mentioned that it has to do with the local self-rule community process, because many biddings have been run in the local communities, which is to say that we are doing and performing the potential that this reform provides. Indeed, this survey is very important and exciting to us in terms of the fact that the areas where we are working, it raises the public awareness, it raises the success rate. Prior to war, we saw some relevant surveys by different agencies. What we saw then was that there was a deficit of attention to those areas. What we are seeing now is that the attention is very much focused, and it provides us the hope that this way will be successful. We are also aware that perhaps in the full-scale invasion, the situation has changed. What are the major challenges that you are facing, and how confident can we be that we have overcome them? You see, it's quite difficult to pinpoint any area in the life of this country that has not been radically changed with the inception of the war. The system Prozorro bidding process is no exception. For example, in February of 2022, the volume of operations in some areas has decreased 20 to 30 times. It should also be noted that biddings have not ceased to exist. Even on the day of 23rd of February, at that particular day, we had a number of successful biddings conducted. But indeed, step by step, we are seeing improvements. It's now a year and a half that the war is raging on. We are beginning to recover. Everyone is aware that you cannot expect any good times because the war, as you have rightly suggested, is running for 10 years now with its active phase for a year and a half. We have to live, we have to make money, we have to create a condition for the economic welfare, and it is safe to state now that the volumes are recovering. To cite an example, if we talk about a smaller scale privatization since the reform have begun 5 years ago, we have received 15 billion of hryvnias. Out of that, 4.5 billion have been the part that we've seen grow since August. That is to say, despite all the despite all the risks, the system is still working. And correspondingly, we see that the economic counteragents are focusing on our activities. The digitalization reform, perhaps, as the survey indicates, is something that people are aware. People are not only aware, they also believe this reform to be successful. Do you think that 51% of a success rate is good for you? You see, I am a little bit discomforted by the fact that digitalization, according to the survey, it looks as if people believe that the reform has already been fulfilled, but we are only beginning. We have done some work. However, there are a lot of services that have to be digitalized. Indeed, the healthcare digitalization, right now we are having a lot of plans. It makes me glad that very many people believe that the digitalization reform has been a success, but the reform is still going. It's not a complete success. Let me also add here a point not about the digitalization per se. What I'm saying is that the majority of people, as for the state itself, digitalization in its classic example of the iceberg, the run-of-the-mill people from big cities, from small cities, at the top of the tip of the iceberg, they see something that on the surface, but they don't understand that the lion's share of the digitalization of government services is beyond the service. This is where, indeed, we have a lot of work to be done in terms of reforming. What my point is that in the anti-corruption perspective, for the ordinary people, digitalization in the first place is about comfort. It's not about anti-corruption, but when you rebuild the government system in terms of the state purchases, automatization of starting your business that we've done together with the Ministry of Justice. It's about comfort for people, but indeed, it has to do with fighting corruption. I've got a number of points here that we have achieved. It's not only a matter of convenience, but BRD, USAID are the stakeholders, including the UNDP or the Embassy of Sweden. The anti-corruption component in the framework of our activities amounts to 16 billion hryvnias. In the year 2021, we have saved another dozen billions, and this is not our estimate. The anti-corruption effect and economic effect go hand in hand. It's not about the money that has been given as bribes. We are talking about the systemic bribe or the smaller scale bribe to skip the line, to jump the line, to circumvent some judicial requirements. It's not only about the economic reform, it's about the convenience rendered to people. For example, opening your own business. Private businesses are now being set up automatically, saving a lot of resources at the Ministry of Economy. It has to do with anti-corruption, of course. I believe that everyone remembers the fact that on our side, you see the access to development services. One area that has been traditionally most fraught with corruption. We have set up a new register, and a number of services in terms of the development have been automatized now, and anti-corruption development effect is 11 billion. Automatic starting of your business, 27 billion. The baby system seems to be about convenience. It combines 9 services that has to do with the newly born children, but the saving effect is in the ballpark of 35 million hryvnias. That is to say, people who have been canvassed, they are ordinary people, and their assessment is very important in terms of their attitude and in terms of their assessment. Documents are available on their smartphones, and even abroad, the DIA service is recognized abroad. Many people believe it's efficient, up to 61%. The rest of the people believe that digitalization is successful, but I have cited a couple of examples to make sure that we understand there is a lot of work to be done, and the anti-corruption task of the anti-corruption reform that we are all talking about is directly bound to the digitalization reform. We should also not forget about the recovery of this country. We are talking about the e-recovery. We are using different mechanisms to make sure that they are transparent, that they're available, that they should regulate the amount of money that has earmarked for example, recovery of the damaged households. And to be frank with you, it has to do not only with the Ukrainian, it has to do with the Ukrainians' image abroad. The project that we have implemented in terms of the digitalization, providing different services for recovering this country, it shows to our foreign partner that Ukraine is a reliable partner, that money can be invested here, even under the circumstances of the ongoing war. Do you believe that convenience is number one? You see, to me, these criteria are different. Digitalization is a global process. It comprises many components. Essentially, I would say that it perhaps has to do with the customers of the services. The state itself is the customer, economics of the country, the state budget, foreign partners of Ukraine, or other stakeholders. This is a complex thing, but it is comprised of many components. Alexandra, let's talk with you about the healthcare reform, something that will always be number one priority. Where have you been successful? My colleague is right in saying that the reform has been implemented. in a way, it is only the beginning of our path. The reforms and the rate of it that we had achieved before the war is still going on because hospitals are being funded. The electronic component has been working all the time since the beginning of the war. The healthcare system and our services have received more than 200 billions. Now we have received 80 billion hryvnias for our services. All the services that were available before the war are still being accessed and available. We have new services like rehabilitation for inpatient and outpatient services. It is important during the war. The current year has seen the rehabilitation process of inpatients. We have the number of those 69,000 and outpatient more than 1,000 instances. What is more important is this: reform has to do with the electronic services. It provides for the transparency. We fight the corruption everywhere on a daily basis when the doctors cannot demand that you pay some bribes for them. On the other hand, we can compare the services available at different hospitals. The patients also have to have the ability to claim that they need other services. I can't but ask you that surveys show that I think 80% of the respondents of the Ukrainians believe that the healthcare reform has been a success. Do you believe that people have expected too much of this reform vis-a-vis the digitalization reform? When I'm saying that a decade ago we didn't believe that we would have our electronic documents available on our smartphones, something that other countries in Europe have yet to deliver on. Indeed, there have been some expectations that have been too high. And it is understandable that people want to have a high-quality services available. People believe that they have to be free of charge. And you have heard in the presentation that free of charge services or high-quality services are not available anywhere. Patients have to be online. They have to wait in line for services to be available. Yes, it has to do with the patients per se, but it's done everywhere. Thank you. Mr. Sluchik is working for the integrity cities. What's the local success rate? We should understand in the first place that if we want to minimize the corruption risks, there are 3 points to that, locally or otherwise: process, people, and digitalization. The specifics of the process is that these processes have to go in parallel. You have people, it's good. If you don't have digitalization capability, then you will create chaos. Let us go back to reality check. For example, in the Mykolaiv, they have, in the city council, they have a couple of people on official documents, which is not something in reality. Digitalization requires a lot of money to be invested. Internal auditing, budgeting, so on. You have to have specialists. High-quality specialists are difficult to find. Some people have gone to the Ukrainian army. On the other hand, the public service is not something where you are a highly paid specialist. This is where we come in handy. We provide the capability. That's one thing. The other thing is high expectations that have to be balanced out. That is to say, what's going on in localities? We have to provide complex services. People are waiting for this. In parallel, we want to minimize the corruption risks. And the third point is that the infrastructure has to be recovered. 3 parallel tracks. The key component that the government has singled out, and we believe in this, is increase of the capabilities through the legislation process. On the other hand, the availability of the digitized portfolio of services. The processes that have to be digitalized for the recovery. We also should be aware that it comes down to people. People must be found. Unless we have found the people who are ready to work as public servants, for example, in the Department of the Internal Auditing, something that is not very appealing, where you work for the monthly salary of 30 to 40,000 hryvnias. You see, I don't have the answer. This is a classic trap. When a country finds itself in war or in some natural disaster, when people leave the country and the specialists focus on the high priority issues, for example, serving in the Ukrainian armed forces. The other important point is that people expect too much. We should be aware that such expectations efficiently cannot be met. It has to do with the water supply services, with the health services, with the public transportations. Public want us to deliver a lot. For example, Mr. Sienkiewicz, the city mayor of our city, has initiated a process when every investigative journalist has the access to all the money that has been spent on the local projects. In terms of the system of the general project, people should be aware that corruption is a highly risk project that is likely to be exposed. If we continue our surveys, people are expecting a lot from the state. And the matter of being well received by the community, what does the government do? We can recover our infrastructure, we have to develop. The recovery process is very important, a long, sometimes very uninteresting process that needs a lot of high-quality specialists. It will not be easy to cover. There will be scandals nationally or locally that will have to do with the economic recovery. It is explained by the fact that we are a big country and the processes have not been in place. I think that the European Union sees that we are now doing a lot at the level of the government, at the level of our project. Is it enough? Perhaps it is not enough, because it all comes down to people. Unless we have specialists, people who are able to implement their values in everyday life. You see, the infrastructure has to be recovered. People want the infrastructure to be there. On the other hand, people are constrained by the norms, which is to say that people have to pass sometimes very complex and inadvertent decisions, which brings me back to 3 points that I have singled out before: processes, people, and resources. People will not be there, digitalization will not always work, or otherwise the digitalization will show that the corruption risks are very high. It has to be taken for granted within the framework of the international technical aid. It has to be taken by the media community. On the other hand, sometimes the responsibility for the corruption is very difficult to enforce. We have to do with the complex ethical dilemmas the elected people or people who are working on the public service positions. The situation, we should be aware, is likely to be there for a long time. Self-governance faces a lot of challenges. Local military organizations face challenges. The government faces challenges. There are no simple answers to complex challenges. Complex challenges imply complex and painful decisions. Your forecast is very pessimistic, but I would also like to mention that there are reforms that are working better than others. There are resources, there are people, there are leaders who are implementing such reforms. My point was not about pessimism. I was trying to make sure that we understand the challenges. Digitalization, for example, we should be aware where to funnel the resources to receive the added value. Anti-corruption officers, let us be frank, efficiently do not affect the overall situation. Their capability must be strengthened. This process will not be swift. And even the international technical aid, let us be frank, people are saying that it is very difficult to find high-quality specialists. You should also understand that nobody except the decision makers, people who are ready to work as public servants, they will be the ones that will be delivering on the transformation. These should be people who are ready to take on responsibilities in the ministries. I think more than 30% of the public service personnel have been dismissed. Some of them left the job, some of them joined the Ukrainian armed forces. It's difficult to deliver on the reforms. We should be aware of this. Of course, 10 years ago, self-governance institutions then and now are different things. Now you can access eServices on your smartphone. 10 years ago, there was no way for you to know what's going on in the local authorities unless you physically go to the building of the local authorities. Budgets, local budgets, was something that was open to the head of the administration and the local officers that were part of the local treasury. Media, especially investigative journalists, we see that the access is there, transparency is there, and the quality of investigations have grown. Situation is different, of course, but the history is that the challenges have dramatically changed, so the basis of comparison should be different. Medicine, for example, healthcare and digitalization. What is the question here? There are high standards, for example, in the private hospitals. When we talk about digitalization in the healthcare, it's a complex system. Anti-corruption campaign is different. It has been beefed up by the demands and expectations of our international partners. We should be aware that the state is likely to take the decision that will be inadvertent and compliance for the anti-corruption activities will be must if we want to receive international aid. These steps will be difficult, but the changes are there. They are taking place. Irina, I would like to give the floor to you. The anti-prevention of corruption bodies is, as we call them, young bodies, but there is a lot of expectation that you will be a guarantee for the anti-corruption. Please tell me that you can affect the situation. I will be working as the advocate of the anti-corruption reform. There is a lot of public request. People are aware of this campaign. The anti-corruption reform and the need for it is not something new. Back in 2014, at the first Maidan, there was a lot of expectations in terms of anti-corruption activities. Legislation was passed on the prevention of corruption, and the country began to build up different bodies such as National Agency for Prevention of Corruption, Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office. At that point in time, as it is now, there is a lot of need to see that the justice is done, that people ask for the law enforcement to make sure that the punishment is there, that the infliction of penalty is seen. Anti-corruption bodies, for the first time in history, we can quote the people that go behind the bars, public servants that were engaged in the monopolistic activities, that is to say, officials have seen real indictments and punishment, and indictments up to 12 years of imprisonment. That's one thing. On the other hand, this process has brought back a lot of money to the public purse, because a lot of anti-corruption activities have been exposed. But the punishment in itself, yes, it provides satisfaction to the public eye. But if we look at Ukraine as a European country, and we bet on the recovery and development, we should look into the area of prevention of corruption. This is where all the instruments of digitalization, all the IT decisions are called to bring the added value there. We know that the National Agency for the Prevention of Corruption is run by a very efficient officials. We have been successful, but yes, it'll take a long time, as all the panelists have suggested. It will not be done overnight. IT kits are part of this. The analysis of the legislation, financial controls, declaration, and the conflict of interest issue. The political parties, when they open their resources and their way they spend their money, all this has to do with the development of the prevention of corruption in general. The other major area is that the Department of Integrity at the National Agency. This is where the whole reform should have started, but the public wanted to see punishment. Now we have come down to public awareness. We are working with the public, we are working with the school children, we are targeting new areas of education together with other ministries. This is exactly where we think we will bring up new generation with new set of values, with a new set of worldview. Young people that we are working with at some point in time will be the public servants that will carry and will be guided by the new set of values, values of new values, but it'll take time. You see, it's difficult to work with the older generation, but integrity should be brought up. What can we do now, every one of us? I like the idea that the state is not some abstract substance that has been imposed on us. State is everyone. Local community is everyone. Every housing community is the area of responsibility of every particular citizen. On my side of the equation, it looks like we should take advantage of the available kits. In this country, we seem to be having more kits, all the digital instruments, a lot of registers are available. In it, electronic claims and petitions are available online. We can impact the life of our communities. You should be taking interest in how the local resources are being earmarked, how the renaming of the streets are conducted from Russian into Ukrainian, all the possible areas. You should be taking interest in what's going on around you. Infrastructure for the fighting corruption is there. We should take advantage of this. Now, at the conclusion of this discussion, we see that people request that digitalization should be going on, the reforms must be delivered on, the state has to deliver. What is the point of intersection, if any, and what are the challenges that we are facing? One of the challenges that we have not spoken about enough is the media area. What the Ukrainians consume when they want to make head or tail in this reform crusade. These issues have been touched upon when Ilona was talking about the survey results, when she said, what is the thing that people understand? What is the pension reform, education reform? Do people understand what is the essence of the reform, or people have their own idea? It comes down to the media that they consume, to the opinion leaders that they listen to, and other forces that people are impacted upon. Apart from that, Mr. Taras suggested that media can expose the ways of how the corruption is being fight. Journalists have the kit to make sure that they expose corruption, to trail corruption, to investigate corruptions, to make sure that integrity is there in the activities of the local powerfuls, to make sure that we prevent corruption rather than expose it on television, in the Telegram channels, in other online social media. When people talk about corruption all the time, you have the impression that you are surrounded by corruption only. And sometimes people don't see the link between the fact that their instruments are there, kits are there, investigations are there, judicial decisions are there, tells us that the corruption is being fought, not indicative of the fact that the corruption is growing. We should look into this cause and effect link. It's not all about anti-corruption steps done by Ukraine. Another painful topic that I thought of just now when I was listening to our panelists, I was thinking to myself where the manipulation and lie is, not only on the side of the Russian Federation, but amongst Ukrainian body politic. We've been looking after the top Ukrainian policymakers exposing their lies. We have included into top 5 or top 3 topics since 2017. Healthcare system manipulation is something that people are tending to manipulate. When we were told that all the Ukrainian doctors will leave Ukraine for abroad, the healthcare system will be based on your payment, there were a lot of bending of information. There are a lot of myths that have been debunked by the Ministry of Healthcare, by the anti-corruption bodies, by the NGOs, by everybody. At this point in time, I don't see any populism in this area, but this has been taken advantage by the Russian propaganda, and they are trying to manipulate Ukrainian public opinion. Anti-corruption crusade is something that they want to be blown out of every proportion. They highlight some cases, but they tend to forget that the fact that the corruption is being fought, the prevention of corruption is being done. Russian resources don't mention this. As for the rest of the reforms, year in, year out, we see that the policymakers try to use it as their rhetoric. Facility, for example, gas market, the agricultural lands. It was a topic number one in 2019 and 2020. Pension reform, education reform are very well suited for manipulation. Why? Because it has to do with the welfare and with the quality of life of the ordinary people. This is what has brought us together, because our survey has demonstrated this. Welfare of the population is the basis for the populism, for the policymakers. The conclusion is this. As a fact checker, I am tracing the Russian disinformation. I see how Russia is discrediting Ukrainian anti-corruption process to make sure that we don't move on our way to European Union or to NATO. However, there is a risk that in this country we will see the growth of political populism. If not this year, that it'll go up next year. All the reforms in our survey, the reform that we have identified as the high priority topic, this will be the topic for political manipulation. It has to do with the people's everyday life. It has to do with the people's welfare. Now, if policymakers listen to us, they know what to manipulate with in their next political campaign. Unfortunately, Ukrainians are very likely to give in to this political manipulation. Can the state-run media help this? Of course, we remember about debunking and pre-bunking. NGOs can react to different canards and lies, but pre-bunking is something that the government can take on board. They have the information resource, they have the media available. In simple terms, government should tell us what is going on in the simple language, in plain words. As it has been suggested before, it's not about the depth of the iceberg. It should be all about the tip of the iceberg. The government should tell people what will bring up our welfare and what is the advantage of this reformation process. I think healthcare reform is very simple to explain. When you get in line to be checked by the doctor, you don't have to bribe your GP as it was done during the Soviet times. People know that the doctors are being paid by the government to take care of you. There are a lot of stereotypes that have been rooted. We have to fight them, but simple, plain language is very powerful. And plain language is powerful. Ukrainians will understand that if something has to do with their everyday life, when the message comes from the government, this will prove to be very efficient. It will also make our work simpler because we will have fewer lies to be debunked. As a way of comment, the perception of corruption and perception of the rate of corruption. At the end of 2022, there was a survey, a public opinion survey of the Ukrainians, asking people What is in your thinking the level of corruption? More than 54% of respondents replied that the major problem for Ukraine is corruption, is war. War is problem number one. At the same time, when we ask people whether you have given bribes to officials, have you witnessed corruption, 15% of the respondents said positive. So there is a great difference between the perception of the corruption and those who know firsthand about the corruption. I agree with you. It has to do with the media impact, including the Russian psychological information. A good news is that Anti-Corruption Agency, with our partners, we are developing state-run anti-corruption communication campaign. We will publicly present our idea. It is a strategy that will come in handy for all the state bodies to communicate the idea of fighting corruption, about making sure that we know what are the tools available to the public to fight corruption, so that we believe that a lot will be done on this way. Dear colleagues, I would like to ask you to field questions from the floor.
Alexandra, Ukrinform.
Alexandra from Ukrinform. What can we do to renew the trust between the society and the state? In this particular area, anti-corruption sphere, the communication run by the government is not enough. That's one question. Second issue is this. You mentioned that you are working in schools, you are addressing school children. Corruption in the sphere of education, what's done there? We have heard the scandals about bomb shelters in schools. There have been some embezzlement there as well. I agree with you that we should not be working with children alone. That's why our school children program is a many-component project. On the one hand, it takes on board the educational process when we talk to children, to their teachers, what the integrity is, how it should be perceived. But the other component is the transformation of the educational environment per se. We are now developing recommendations. It will be called an educational compass. It will help schools to develop the transparent toolkit on how to communicate with parents, how to engage money without corruption, how to donate to your local school without corruption element. We are working on this part of the equation. Of course, if we leave to its own resources the education, we talk to children saying that corruption is bad, but while on leaving this school, children or their parents are asked to put in some money in a corrupt way, it will brought to naught all the effects of the trust between the state and the community. It's about the transformation of the educational environment in itself. Thank you very much, dear friends, for this panel discussion. It's very important. We don't have any more questions. Oh, yes, we do. One more question. One thing is where you are right, that some percentage of people face corruption. The other thing is that majority of people must be confronted. It looks to me to have to do with the political corruption. It is very harmful. This is what people mean when they demand that the reforms should be delivered on. Do you investigate political corruption? I don't believe that this is a most detrimental part. It is part that is most seeable. It is most manifested. We talk about public servants, the amount of the bribes. If it comes to light, you see, it always is a hot news and a breaking news. What we see is this: if somebody has been caught being bribed, or if a high official has been investigated, it tells us that the anti-corruption system is working. Due and thanks to the anti-corruption activities, the investigations are being brought to court, there are imprisonments foreseen, and law enforcement is effected. The other thing is the number and the volume of large-scale corruption. It overshadows the fact when I have gone to some local authority, has given a smaller bribe, I have received some favors from the local authorities. I think that work requires systemic work. We should not be focused only on political corruption. Let me also add here, as far as our survey is concerned, there is an open question. People were asked about their thinking about the reasons of corruption. 38% say that legislation is not working. We can all always agree on something. 14% comes down to our national way of thinking as something that we have received from the Soviet Union, and then avarice, the low level of salary, of weak economy, poorness, and oligarchs, non-transparency, and public disinterest are not very much popular in the assessment. Higher three priorities singled out by our responders is that it's a typical way of Ukrainian mentality. This is likely to be very difficult to change. Mentality, I think, is very difficult, the most difficult project to be changed, because you want to speed up things, because you don't believe that there is any other way. It's not a representative thought. My own thinking is that when people have to find a solution to a problem, people don't look for legislation. People don't look into how it can be done legally. People want to resolve their issues as fast as possible. My subjective take is it makes me wonder. Now, I've been working in the NGO sphere for many years now. Some processes are very fast on the delivery, cyber police, issuing documents, something that I have confronted personally. Without additional presence, thanks, it's working. It's very speedy. We see the lack of the success stories. It should be publicized. People should know and should be aware that there are success stories. It has to be locally identified and then should be brought up to a larger scale, internationally, for example. Perhaps our international partners would be interested in listening to the local success stories, these success stories that are not on the front pages of the international media. These are smaller steps, but these are smaller steps on the way to fighting corruption big time. We have more questions. Marta Pivovarenko, representing newsletter, international newsletter published by the NGO community. I believe you are the internationalists. Such local stories must be made public. I think that the judicial awareness is very important. Once you know how to do something legally, it will be done. My question is the way the Russian Federation discredits Ukrainian way of reforms. My organization is working in the psychological, mental area, and we see, as do many other NGOs in Ukraine, the attack of the chatbots in terms of mental reception of the rehabilitation of veterans and all psychological literature that have to do with, for example, the initiative by the First Lady. They are prone to Russia information attacks by their bots. Everyone sees this. It's sometimes very difficult to discriminate the chatbots or illiterate public in Russia who are rooting for the fact that nothing good can be done in Ukraine. What do you plan to do in fighting Russian discreditation campaign of the Ukrainian reforms? Thank you. I am the holder of microphone, so I will begin. You see, discrediting the psychological rehabilitation for the military as well as for the civil population is something that my colleagues and I have seen the upsurge for a couple of months now. They're saying that mental hospitals have been closed in Ukraine, so crazy people are wandering along the Ukrainian streets. This is something they were telling about before the war. TB was another issue. Illiterate public is something I don't believe in. You see, people are guided by the emotions, not by the logic. People might not be likely to respond to such provocations. Sometimes when you see the social media that is putting up some inadequate information, but the Russian information is targeting this particular Ukrainian way of reforms. They are taking on board and targeting most painful areas that have to do with the everyday life of ordinary Ukrainians, the areas that have to do with the state of health of Ukrainians. We were applying to the United Nations with the claim that this obstructs the process of objective, unbiased information, leading to harmful decisions made by ordinary people. What do we plan to do here? As an AGO representative, I can tell you that my colleagues and I continue to expose and debunk such fakes. We are working with the Meta Corporation, at least in identifying them on Instagram, putting them in a context. What I see more and more is that NGOs combine their efforts with the government-run bodies to ensure that we increase the capabilities of the state in terms of our expertise. In general, both NGOs and government, we are reaching an international level more and more. You've seen, for example, something called informational Rammstein. This is only a suggestion. Step one, perhaps information Rammstein could have been our way to addressing international community in debunking Russia dis and misinformation campaign, preventing us from moving closer to the European Union or NATO or receiving international help and aid. Ladies and gentlemen, do you have questions? No more questions. I would like to thank all the panelists for this meaningful conversation. It is very timely. It makes sense to talk about those things. We know that we are facing a recovery process. It'll take a long time, and I think these reforms will come in handy. I wish you all, the stakeholders of these reforms, for your plans to be delivered on, and we will be the happy consumers of the results of your reforms. Thank you, everybody. Traditionally, I thank the Ukrainian Armed Forces for this opportunity for us to enjoy this talk. We are working towards our victory. Glory to Ukraine.